Thank you for tuning in to the BVLOS Blueprint. I'm Adam Zorkelbach, and here with me is our Director of Regulatory Affairs, Rob Knockenhauer. We're going to be talking about shielded operations. We wanted to dive deeper into this topic because in the last episode, we really talked about the evolution of the waivers and the value that they establish. And what we really honed in on was that shielded ops is one of the most valuable waivers you can really leverage right now in terms of true BVLOS. So Rob, let's just get right into it. Can you kind of explain and tell us what shielded ops are?
Yeah, you bet, Adam. Thanks. So shielded ops, as we mentioned last time, it is the waiver that the FAA has been granting to folks to allow them to leverage either the ground or infrastructure or other natural structures like trees, that sort of thing, as basically it's low altitude or infrastructure shielding is what they're calling it. And so what it is the premise is that if your aircraft is operated below a certain altitude, that the likelihood of there being an actual collision risk with a crewed aircraft is reduced significantly. The recommendation of this shielded operations came out of the BVLOS ARC report that was released in March of 2022, where a number of folks in the industry and folks from the FAA and other groups put together, in amongst a whole myriad of other things, this recommendation for low altitude shielding. Basically, the idea was, what they recommended was if you can keep your operation below 100 feet AGL or 100 feet of, from away from your infrastructure, that, you're going to have a very low likelihood of having a collision risk. So that said, the FAA finally, it took them probably, not quite a year, but, basically at the beginning of 2023, the FAA started granting those low altitude shielding requests. A lot of them out of the gate. And I think part of what happened there was, there was another thing that was called the tactical BVLOS approval, which is not something that we've done at Census because, it's the premise of a tactical BVLOS operation is for, like, if you're flying on the other side of a bridge doing an inspection, which is something that's more suited for a multi-rotor than a fixed wing asset like what we operate here at Census. So I think part of, once those were starting to become a bit more ubiquitous, not ubiquitous, but certainly a number of operators were getting the approvals for those tactical BVLOS operations, and there were no issues there. So I think the FAA was in a place where they could actually, feel more comfortable releasing those, shielded operational approvals. And in the case about how we're using them here at Census is for long linear infrastructure runs. And so part of what we discussed last week was about on the Sentaero 5, how we have the L-Site Halo as our C2 link solution that allows us to run operations up to 50 miles. In fact, we have a waiver that allows us to do operations up to 50 miles. So it'd be a point-to-point operation because the aircraft range is about 55 miles. So it would be it has to be a one-way flight in that regard. So we have the permission to do that. And what we have done is we have run those operations. We're going to get into that in a little bit, but certainly, so we have that criteria in place, and then beyond that, for the shielded operations, other ways that it can be leveraged is through the use of multi-rotors. So you can run a multi-rotor and run shielded operations. The one requirement that the FAA is leaning on is having an ADS-B input. So our aircraft, as part of our onboard DAA sensor, has an ADS-B input. I know certainly aircraft like the M300 has an ADS-B input. I believe maybe a Harris aircraft does as well. And so there's a number of multi-rotors that also have that level of airspace awareness through cooperative broadcasting aircraft. So, and then finally, the thing that's really interesting, for those linear asset inspections, there is another use case that's been leveraged pretty aggressively in the past year, which is the drone in a box solution. So, I think the biggest press has gone to Skydio for their drone in a box solutions, where they've got a number of partnerships with a number of utility companies, and I think railway companies that are using them to do, the box becomes fixed at a high value asset like a substation or a rail yard, and then the operation is run completely remote, where you have a remote operator who logs into the aircraft and conducts the mission. And basically the premise there is they keep that aircraft within 50 or 100 feet of the assets, and everybody's happy. So it's a really great way that's really starting to get measurable ROI out of these assets. So it's exciting place to be.
Yeah, and shielded operations, they really do make sense because we've talked about originally when we got our shielded operations waiver approval, flying 50 feet above a structure, even for us, is almost close for a fixed wing. So for a crewed aircraft to be flying within that kind of 50-foot buffer above trees or power lines, it just makes sense that they shouldn't or wouldn't be there unless it was some kind of emergency on their end. But I mean, it really does make sense, and I'm glad that the FAA was able to come to this solution because we really are able to leverage more of our technology's capabilities. In the past, it was kind of always the regulation was always the inhibitor, but now we actually have a pathway to leverage regulation combined with technological capability.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the one thing I will point out that is the drawback on shielded operations for like operations that are like surveying, where altitude becomes your friend for capturing more data per pass than you can do the lower you're flying. So it's while it has given a lot of operators the ability to do a lot of things in a way that's far less restrictive than it's ever been. It's not the holy grail by any stretch. So our goal moving forward beyond shielded operations is certainly to explore ways that we can embrace, other operational procedures to kind of leverage the onboard DAA sensor that we have today, and then looking at other DAA solutions in the future. So it's it's a great thing, but I personally want to see it be even less restrictive than it is today.
So thanks for going over that, Rob. I mean, you're right. Regulation has come a long way, and we still have a long way to go. But one of the use cases that I wanted to talk about was an operation that we recently conducted back towards the end of 2023 in South Florida. Can you kind of run through what that operation was for us, Rob?
Yeah, so that was an incredible operation. So we were working with the South Florida Water Management District, and what we did is they identified a section of their canal waterways that they wanted to get an assessment of algae blooms, that sort of thing, for their environmental studies. And so what we were able to do is we identified a 15-mile section of the canal that we were able to use our performance-based criteria, identify a path that we could fly safely under the constraints of our waiver request, and actually fly and get it done. And so part of that evaluation was looking at the LTE coverage. So that's part of the way our waiver is written, and the way the waivers are written for other folks that we put this together for is that we're basically assessing the FCC coverage maps to assure that we have adequate cell coverage for the areas that we're identifying as part of this BVLOS operational corridor. And in this case, this section of South Florida had adequate coverage, and we were able to run the operation. And so, we got down and we did the site surveying was a little bit more involved because there was, one of the not issues, but certainly one of the concerns about flying that low is that if you were to reference a typical VFR map, a VFR map will identify hazards that are at 200 feet and above ground level. So if you're flying at 100 feet above ground level, it doesn't identify any hazards that are lower than that. And so in our case, we're operating at 75 feet above ground level. And so we had to make sure that we identified like all of the, we knew for a fact that there was a bridge that we had to cross. There was some, easily identified high power line lines that we crossed. But as it turns out, what we discovered when we got there is that there were also some lower voltage power lines that were crossing the canal as well that we didn't identify until we got on site. So that kind of points out that there's still some robustness that needs to be added in your site evaluation that was required, and that we executed on as per what we had described that we would do in our waiver request anyways. And so but it was an interesting thing, so there's definitely concerns flying low. But once we got to the operation and got it underway, the thing that I found the most exciting was that C2 link. So we had that L site connection to the aircraft, and we never lost it. And so having run a number of BVLOS operations in the past, both with Census and with other folks that I've worked with in the past, using ISM radios, I have had the experience on more than one occasion of losing link with the aircraft when it's doing its BVLOS operation. The good news is in each of those operations, the requirements is that you program the aircraft to return home or travel onto an alternate landing site in the event of a link loss. And in each of those operations I've done in the past, that worked as planned. So no issues there, but certainly if you actually need to rely on capturing data on an ISM link and you've planned out an operation to go out, say, 3 miles, and you get to 2.5 miles and the aircraft turns around and you missed that last half mile of data capture, then you've got to go through the process of breaking down, setting up, and capturing that last half mile of data. So it's the robustness of the LTE connection and being able to assure that we were able to fly that 15 miles out and back, which for us was the longest flight operation we'd ever run. So that was exciting in and of itself. But the fact that we had that robust link was just, it was amazing.
Yeah, that event down in South Florida, that was a really fun one and a really proud moment watching the aircraft, do what it was built to do.
Yes.
But thanks for giving us the rundown on shielded ops here, Rob. If you haven't already, check out our last video. We talked about the evolution of waivers and the value of how they've grown over time. And yeah, if you have any requests on what you would like us to talk about in the future, go ahead and drop them in the comments below. But our next episode, we're going to be talking more about performance-based waivers. As Rob mentioned, mapping is not really built for the shielded ops. So there is another way to get the most value out of your drone with a performance-based waiver. So we're going to get more into that next week. But until then, thanks for tuning in. And Rob, always a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Adam. Take care.
Thanks, Rob.